So, for example, one of my patients came in and he said, "Doctor, I'm so depressed, I think I want to kill myself." And I said, "Why is that?" And he says, "Well, I'm just a total failure." And I said, "What way are you a total failure?" And he said, "Well, I'm a failure as a husband, as a parent, as a business person, as a homekeeper, as a home supporter, and so on." So I could have, at that level, just talked about his sense of helplessness and failure. But I wanted to get more information. So instead of addressing helplessness, which seems to be across the board there, or the sense of failure, or the sense of frustration, I started taking each of these components in order, keeping in mind that the overall meaning of what he said did have to do with failure, right? It's pretty clear that his belief, "I am a failure," had just grabbed hold of him and now was playing out in every aspect of his life. So I asked, well, first of all, you said you're a failure as a husband. So what's happened recently that gave you that thought? He says, "Well, when my wife went off for work today, she didn't say goodbye." And I said, "Well, so what does that mean to you?" And he says, "Well, it means she doesn't love me." I said, "Why is that?" He says, "Because she always says goodbye, but now she must be ticked off and she doesn't love me, and somehow, I don't know what, but there's something about me that turns her off." So I said, okay. So then I kept going on. So I said, "Now what makes you think that you're a failure as a father?" And he says, "Well, because the kids all were fighting this morning." So I said, okay. And I said, "What makes you think that you're a failure as a businessman and a provider?" And he says, "Because I just looked at the budget report, and we're going to go in debt for the next 3 months." And then finally I said, "Well, what about your failure as a homekeeper?" And he said, "Well, the roof is caving in the house." So here we could have just dealt with the common denominator. The meaning is he's a failure in each of these things, and could have talked about the failure. But then I broke it up into each compartment. And this is what we wouldn't have done as a psychoanalyst. Psychoanalyst, we would have looked for an unconscious meaning, or might be for the conscious meaning. But we break this up into the different pieces. So I then asked him, "What about your wife running off?" I said, "Do you remember anything that happened prior to her running off?" And he said, "Well, she was very rushed at breakfast." And I said, "Yeah, do you remember any conversation that you had?" And he said, "Well, I guess she told me she had a very important meeting coming up." And I said, "Oh, and what else did she say?" And she said, she said she was late for the meeting. And I said, "Oh, well, is it possible that the reason she rushed off without saying goodbye was that she was in a hurry?" And he says, that does make sense." So then I asked him, "What about your teenagers fighting all the time?" And he said, "Yeah, it's terrible. I just can't seem to control them." And I said, "Well, what about the other kids in the neighborhood? Are they all very quiet and they all get along?" And he said, "Yeah, I guess teenagers do fight." And then I asked him, "What about the business?" He says, "Well, we're going to run a deficit next year, or next semester." And I said, "But I know you're in the clothing business, and I understand you run through cycles. And you run through the cycle where you're making more money than you're spending, and then you run through another cycle where you're spending more money, you're manufacturing the dresses, and then you make up for it the next trimester when you start selling the dress. He said, yeah, I guess you're right. So then I said, well, now what about the roof caving in? And he says, well, the roof was leaking. And I said, yes. And he says, well, it's caving in. So I said, well, what do people do when the roof is leaking? And he says, well, I don't know. I said, well, what did you do in the past when you had problems with the roof? He said, oh, I called the roofer. So I said, well, isn't that a job for the roofer? And he said, yeah, you might be right.